Welcome to Art 101. Now, what I want to teach you guys today is a lot of different techniques, but specifically we're going to talk about still lifes and how to draw them, and a little bit about art history as well. First things first, what is a still life? Still lifes are pretty simple, and a lot of artists use them to practice and hone their ability and their skills. A still life is anytime you have an inanimate object or objects, stack them on top of a table primarily, usually involving some pieces of fabric to cut up the picture plane, and then you begin to draw or paint them. Pretty simple stuff, and you're going to be able to do it by the end of this lesson. One of the great artists and great still life artists of all time was Jean-Baptiste Simon Chardin. He's an 18th century French painter, and I want to tell you a little more about him.
Chardin would also use the technique of impasto, an Italian word meaning mixture of dough. In essence, what he did was he would take large globs of paint and allow them to stick to the canvas, applying a slight bit of texture, whereas before there would be none. Thanks to his carefully balanced composition, or the arrangement of objects in his picture, along with a soft diffusion of light on his objects, his still lifes were notorious for being very realistic. He only created about 200 pictures total in his entire career as an artist. That's only about 4 a year, but you can tell where the time was spent in these fine, great works of art.
Oftentimes, artists use the principles and elements of art and design. For example, right now you're looking at a pretty good idea of what a sense of balance would be. This is a very asymmetrical balance. There's more of me and less of this side of the screen. Makes sense, right? If all of a sudden we were to shift where now this is the center of the screen and there's an equal amount of steps on this side and equal amount of steps on that side, we're now in a symmetrical design. And that's pretty good balance to the proportions of this actual screen. Another element is emphasis. Take, for example, you have a silver rod standing right here. It's bright. It shines a lot against this gray background of the carpet. You are looking directly at it because it's basically a focal point or an emphasis of this entire picture plane. Another element of design is simply proportion. You know that I'm so big because, well, I'm sitting next to things that you see in everyday life. But for all you know, these could be really tiny steps and I could be a giant. That would really break proportion.
Another kind of proportion is called comparative measurement. Whenever the artist takes his or her thumb and a pencil or some kind of measurement device and scales other objects to the ones within the picture plane. For example, you've seen this before, whenever an artist kind of holds their thumb up and kind of sticks their tongue out and thinks too hard, really what they're doing is they're measuring one object in comparison to another in the same still life.
Still life doesn't have to be what we expect it to be. Take, for example, the 13th century painter Mao Tse's Six Permissions. It's very simplistic with its use of line. At the same time, a still life can be completely abstract, like the 20th century Cubist painter Georges Berck.
Another 20th century painter who was able to bridge the gap between the 19th century Impressionistic movement and the radically new Cubist movement was a man by the name of Paul Cézanne.
A French artist, Cézanne, was often found to be expressing himself through color through his gestural brushstrokes. Now, you could use your own gestures in your drawings as well. A gesture is any time you're using quick brushstrokes or quick pencil lines to get a generalized idea down onto paper. Cézanne made an entire living out of it. Of course, his paintings were not necessarily photorealistic, and not every still life has to be photorealistic. Some artists, however, prefer their art to be as realistic as possible, to the point where they're actually deceiving the audience. We call that trompe-l'œil. It's a French word which means fool the eye. What's interesting about trompe-l'œil is the artists will actually go through the skilled process of making objects not only full scale, but also to make sure that they are not cut off by the picture plane, or the frame in this case. That way, whenever you were to see it in a gallery, you might actually be under the illusion that these are realistic objects. I'll show you some examples.
Using his skills of trompe-l'œil, take for example Pierre Borel del Casau's 1854 painting, Escaping Criticism. You can see that it has an extreme sense of realism. Also, take for example the American artist John Frederick Pietto. He was almost completely forgotten by history until most of his art and paintings were rediscovered a little bit after his death.
You can tell the extreme sense of realism in his paintings as well, especially taking into account that these paintings were done to full scale, so walking in and seeing them hanging on a canvas in a gallery, you might actually be under the illusion that they were real.
A good sense of depth or three-dimensional space is something that you can use in your own drawings to really push the fact that we're trying to go for a photorealistic feel. Take, for example, this long breezeway. There's a good sense of three-dimensional space in here. You know that I'm standing closer to you as opposed to standing really far away. So, there's also a good idea that goes into looking at a photograph or a painting such as this, which is a good sense of value. Basically, tint being the lighter colors and shadow and shade being the darker colors. There's an Italian word for this called chiaroscuro, which literally translates to light and dark. An artist who made a great sense of chiaroscuro was someone named Gustave Courbet, a French painter who's from the 19th century. Pretty interesting chap. What he's done is he's actually gone through and bridged the gap from Romanticism all the way over to Impressionism. He referred to it as realism. Now, a lot of other artists have done the same thing, and realism basically covers a photorealistic feel. Of course, that was before photos. I'll tell you some more.
Courbet also was an active political anarchist. His artwork dealt with many socialist ideals, and through a little bit of interpretation, you're able to see many of these ideals through his artwork. One of the greatest painters and printmakers in all of art history was Rembrandt. A lifelike, although slightly embellished Baroque style, Baroque being a time period of artistic style that was used to exaggerate motion and clear and easily interpreted detail to produce a sense of drama and tension, with highlights and lowlights being accentuated. Rembrandt's style was known all throughout Europe, especially during the Dutch Golden Age period. Another artist known for his high skills in chiaroscuro was named Francisco de Zaraban, a religious painter from Spain. His skills using the lights and darks, the tints and shades, gave him the moniker of being known as the Spanish Caravaggio.
But who was Caravaggio? Michelangelo Merisi de Caravaggio was the most famous artist in all of Rome during the early 1600s. If you were around in Rome during this time, you knew who he was. He was famous. He was like a movie star. Everyone was wowed by his ability to capture realistic light and dark in a painting. It still makes art historians today fascinated by his amazing skills and talents. Unfortunately, when he was a younger man and he originally came to Rome, he had to work a lot of dead-end jobs. He actually worked for other artists in their factory-like studios where they would eventually lay claim to his artwork. It was kind of demoralizing. And to make matters worse, Caravaggio had a problem with fighting. He got in a lot of brawls. And I don't mean rough-and-tumble bar fights. I mean the police are called and he's locked in jail for lots of time. It was a bit of an issue. Eventually it got to be such an issue that in 1606 he actually killed a man from central Italy, which eventually led to even more problems.
Normally, Caravaggio's patrons would pay his way out of any trouble that he had with the law, but after the murder they really couldn't do much for him. He eventually fled to Naples to hide from the police. Originally, it was actually reported that he had died, and eventually many of his fans found out that he was in fact alive, although rather disfigured in his face. He hated his disfigurement so much that he actually went through the process of hiding his own face in a lot of his famous pieces of artwork, like this one here. Whenever he did paint his own face into the paintings, they were almost always as the antagonist character to show his own self-hatred. Only about 80 of his paintings have survived, and although his reputation may precede him, his work is still more influential than ever.
If it wasn't for Caravaggio, there wouldn't have been a Rembrandt, there wouldn't have been a Pietro, there wouldn't have been a Courbet. It's all thanks to his use of chiaroscuro in his actual paintings, which allow other artists to build on top of that ability, just like you're building on your own skills from the past today. What's interesting, though, is where does still life stop and portraiture begin? Take, for example, the artist Giuseppe Arcimboldo. What he's done is he actually goes through and makes portraits of people, famous people even, out of everyday objects, books, vegetables, flowers. It's a pretty interesting line, and he has definitely blurred that line to a hazy gray. Take a look.
Archibald has a style all his own, but is it in fact still life, or is it portraiture? What do you think? Alright, so today we're going to talk about how to do a specific and very nicely done still life. Before we actually talk about how to do the still life though, we do have to know more about our materials that we have before us. So, in order to do that, let's talk a little bit about what we have. Whenever you're doing a still life, if you prefer using more of the pencil idea, we do have a charcoal-based pencil. You can get them at any kind of arts and crafts store, pretty easy to come by, very nice and easy to work with. On the other hand, we do have some nice drawing pencils as well. Now the difference for these is going to be this. You can see in all of these pencils here, they all have a little bit of a shimmer to them. That's because they actually have a high level of graphite. That higher level of graphite is going to make it more like a regular number 2 pencil, where it has a little bit of a shimmer to it. The catch is this: if you're going to use these pencils, do not use these pencils. They don't really play well together. Another type of pencil that you can use is just a straight up white colored pencil. These are really good for adding a little bit of highlight. Once you're done, you can go back and put a little bit of touch up into them. And then finally is a pencil like this here that we call this, the slang term for it is a China marker. It's actually a pencil. You'll notice that you can't really quite put this end in a pencil sharpener, so in order to sharpen it, you just pull down this string just a little bit, kind of get your fingernail in there, and then all of a sudden as you start to peel it off, you will see that more of the China marker is exposed, just like so. Now, this China marker is going to give you a very, very solid, very bold black line, which sometimes is exactly what you want, and other times can actually overpower your drawing. So be very cautious with how you choose to use the China marker. For this particular example, however, I am going to stick primarily to this stuff here. This is called vine charcoal. It comes in a lot of different shapes and sizes. You can get nice and thin or kind of thicker and bolder. Really, in essence, what this is the equivalent of the same kind of stuff that you would burn and barbecue. It is charcoal. It's a little bit more refined for artistic reasons, but in essence, it's the same stuff that artists have been using for hundreds of years that you use to have a cookout with. It's very soft. You can easily break it like so, so be very careful with that. But sometimes you want a specifically hard edge. Perhaps you want a little bit of powder to rub into your page to get it nice and dark, or maybe you just want a smaller piece to fit your hand more properly. So we're going to work with those. A way to kind of think about charcoal, if you've used a chalk-based pastel, they work very similarly in the same kind of vein. We also have 2 different types of erasers, just a regular old white pearl eraser here, as well as this stuff. This gray goo is actually referred to as kneaded eraser. You can see there it kind of comes apart. It's really like playing with gum. It's pretty nasty stuff, but it is an excellent tool to be using while you're working on your still life because it's going to give you a softer erase as opposed to the regular eraser, which is going to give you a nice strong cut line. I prefer to use kneaded erasers as much as possible. And when they do get dirty, you just rip them apart, put them back together, and now you have a brand new eraser. Some other things to think about too, if you're someone who really prefers to use a lot of blending, what you can use are these things here. This is a homemade version. This is one bought out of a store. These are called tortillas. What you can do is go through and actually use them just like a pencil and do a little bit of shading. It's a very crisp, nice way of doing your shading. For this particular purpose, I will not be using them though. I'm going to stick primarily just with the charcoal. So in order to have a better understanding of how to do a still life, the first thing we need to do is start talking about what is a still life. So we need to think about what shape and form are. And in order to do that, we need to think about the actual shapes and forms. Anything in the known universe can be broken down into your basic shapes, those same things that you learned back in kindergarten: a square, a circle, and a triangle. That's absolutely right. It doesn't matter how complicated the object is. It could be something simple like a can of soup, or it could be something a little bit more advanced like a hand-carved plaster imitation of my hall pass. That would work too. Everything can be broken down into these objects. The simple way of thinking about it is this: these are not just two-dimensional objects. With a little flick of your wrist, they can instantly become three-dimensional objects. And because they're three-dimensional objects, that's the kind of dimensions that we are living in. So, for example, if I were to draw, let's say, a can of soup, right? This can of soup, in essence, even though it has some really fine detail up top here, it has lots of shading and shadow, in essence, it's just a cylinder, right? So what I would go through is just start off by drawing a circle, connecting it up, and all of a sudden now I have myself a cylinder. From that cylinder, I can actually go through and actually work out all the fine detail. So I know this line is going to bend. In order to have this bend and not just draw a straight line across, but instead actually bend my line, we refer to that as following the contour of the object, the contour being a basic outline. If you were to take a string and wrap it around, that string wouldn't be straight. It would actually be slightly bent because of the curvature of the can. So we follow the contour as we're using our objects to draw. It doesn't matter what the object is, even to say this top of the can right here where you would actually open the can, that can be broken down too. You can see the obvious, there's a circle right here, but look, there's a little bit of a bent square right there, and this right here is almost a rounded off triangle. You use these three objects in conjunction with each other, and all of a sudden you can have a pretty advanced object in your three-dimensional space. So using shape and form together, using those elements of art as one, you're able to really break through kind of the overall mold. Whenever you're using shape, we usually refer to those more as 2D objects, whereas form refers to more of the 3D based object. So after you're done and you've gone through, you understand some of the principles of blocking in, being able to draw things in three-dimensional form. From there, you're able to really go through and add in a little bit more depth. By adding depth, you can go through and use different terms or ideas of shading. Now, whenever we use the word shading, oftentimes we misuse that word. Shading specifically refers to adding a darker tone. So, for example, if I wanted to add some shade to the top of this can, I would add darker tone. It is now in shadow or in shade. I would add some tint, which means adding a little bit of white to the picture. That little bit of tint is going to give it a highlight. So, on any object that we see in reality, there's a highlight and a low light. You can see right here, right on the center core, there is a bright little reflective light. That would be my highlight. That is the brightest color in the overall picture. Then, as you can see, as it starts to fade away into the shadow, over here is my low light. That would be where my darkest shadow is. Once I have these two tones down, my highlight and my low light, I know every other tone in the picture has to remain within those boundaries. So, if you find that you're having some difficulty with shadow, the best way to think about it is to actually break down something more complex, like a cylinder, into something easier, like a squared off plane. So if I were to cut this across, and pretend that this is made up of a bunch of little facets, almost like a really long stop sign. If I were to break this down into a bunch of little facets, and then just simply color each one like I was to, if I was going to do a value scale. A regular value scale would be something going from light to dark. So in this case, this would be my darkest. This would be kind of a medium. And it gets a little lighter, still lighter, and so on. And now you can start to see the value. So I'm going to wrap this value scale up and around my actual cylinder here. So let's say this is the darkest side, so I'm going to go through and darken this side up. From there, I'll go through the next one over, match that, so that's kind of a darker medium tone. Not quite as dark as my low light, but still pretty dark all the same. Then I get to kind of a medium tone, so I'm putting some color on it, but maybe not nearly as much as before. And then all of a sudden I have my highest highlight over on this side. Now, to you and I, it looks kind of faceted, it looks a little broken, but to the trained eye, by going through, taking a little bit of blending tools, and you start to smudge it all together, pretty soon it starts to feel pretty realistic. You can always go back, like I said, and add in a nicer highlight if you want like a really bright tone to it. And give it a little bit of a pop. Kind of blend that out. And if I really, really need to, if I want to make a pure white highlight, just like there is on the can whenever it reflects off of the light from my lamp over here, I can go back and actually use my eraser, my kneaded eraser, pinch it into a tiny little point like so, and actually give it a nice bright highlight on there. Just going to pick a little bit off, like so. And voila. So now I have a little bit of definition to what once was just a simple non-shaded, non-tinted, non-value scaled cylinder. Now all of a sudden feels a little more three-dimensional. The only thing that it's missing is a thing called a cast shadow. A cast shadow is basically whenever you have a light source coming in one direction, it will actually cast a shadow from the object in the opposite direction. To do so, I just simply add a little bit of tone on the bottom here, like so, a little bit of shade and shadow, kind of fade it out, and all of a sudden now this object begins to feel as if it's actually sitting on the table. That light will actually cause it to be very dark toward the bottom of the can, where there's no light touching, and actually fade out as it goes away in all directions. So all of a sudden now you have really a three-dimensional object sitting on a plane. Right now it could be sitting on a table anywhere. It feels three-dimensional. There's a little bit of an illusion being cast there. So thanks to our shading, our tinting, our highlights, and our lowlights, a little bit of contour lines, we're able to exactly the concepts that we're going here for in our still life. Now, what we want to be able to do is be able to take these ideas and actually bridge them over into a more finalized version of a still life. So, for example, I have a old, gnarly looking apple here with some pits and things, something that no one in their right mind is ever actually going to eat. So, what I'm going to do is set it down over here, and I'm going to use my Vine charcoal. Now, Vine charcoal is going to work differently than a charcoal pencil. A charcoal pencil you saw had a little bit more control over it, like a regular old pencil. Vine charcoal is a lot more messy, which can be really good or really bad. So, let's find out. So I have my apple. Okay. There's obviously a light source coming. I can see the highest highlight is right here, and obviously the lowest low light way in the back over here. So what I'm going to do is start off by blocking it in. I have my basic form of just a cylinder, right? Or excuse me, a circle. Make it into a sphere, adding a couple lines on it so now it feels a little more three-dimensional. And now I want to go through and start to think about, okay, well the top of it is up here, so put a little bit of a mark, and I'm just going to kind of sketch in exactly what I'm going for here. So the top, the little stem is coming up out there. It seems like the darkest dark on the top is right about there. Definitely much more dark on this side. That's where I'm going to have my darkest. And then obviously much lighter up toward the front here. So I don't really even need to put a whole lot of tone or shade on that side. Now the tricky part with matching your shadow is the fact that there is different colors on here as well. So you have to imagine in your head, what would this look like if it was in black and white? An easy way, if you're really struggling with the concept of switching a colored object in your head to black and white, is simply take a photograph of it and switch it to black and white. Not that you want to draw from a photograph, but it will definitely train your eye to see what these things look like in black and white scale. So we are matching that gray scale with our charcoal, Vine charcoal. I can use the side of the object to just lay down some tone. And as I'm going along, I can actually blend it out. You can see it fades very quickly and very softly in order to get a nice, soft, easy tone to what I'm going for. You can add a little bit of texture to it, adding some lines. Realize that anytime you draw a picture, anytime you use an outline like in a cartoon, really that outline is symbolizing where a heavy shadow is. That's all an outline is. Eventually, once you feel much more comfortable drawing these objects, you're able to actually go through and not use outlines at all, because that's the overall goal, is to show an object in a realistic form, which, let's be fair, there's no outlines in real life, so why bother using them in your drawing? Obviously, to practice and to get your idea down initially, that's what you're going for, but in the long run, you want to get away from those outlines. Starting to look a little bit like an apple, maybe kind of a gnarly looking tomato almost. I'm going to make sure to give it more of an apple features. They have these little pits, little dips inside of the apple, so I'm going to go back through and try to add those in. I can definitely see them much more on the darkened side as all those little blemishes on this apple start to show as it gets a little bit darker. So I'm going to go through and kind of pat those out a little bit, make them nice and soft, start to see some lumps forming in this apple. It's going to get pretty gnarly pretty quickly. Obviously, you don't want to forget about having your cast shadow either. So I'm going to add that in too. I can see it's kind of coming around here, going back into space, back into space. We know from previous talks that it is definitely darkest on the bottom and fades out because light is beginning to touch it right around there. It'll kind of fade out a little bit, just like so. Starts to feel much more three-dimensional with that cast shadow involved. A couple more little blemishes, little details, but really it's starting to come into view. Now, something you may want to do is actually go back and use white or a highlight as an actual color tone. It doesn't have to all be a shade of gray. I can go back and use the eraser and really kind of pick things up a little bit. In fact, if I wanted to, something else I could do is actually throw a little bit of tone in the background just for the kind of negative space around the object. Kind of fade that in a little bit. And just by adding in a little bit of negative space, a little tone for that negative space, what I can do is actually use the eraser to show the edge of the apple, because I think the edge of the apple is almost brighter than the background in this particular case. Now you can tell I'm just using my fingers. You're more than welcome to use one of the tortillas or any kind of blending tool that you prefer. And go back through here, really get some highlights on this side, really kind of pick it up. And all of a sudden, throw down some more highlights. It's starting to come into play. I can throw a little bit of a, maybe a tabletop kind of off in the background here, just so I know that the object is actually resting on something. A little darker, off behind the apple. And it starts to take on its final form. So there's not a whole lot to actual still life drawing. Like I said, this is just a quick little preview of how to take a regular everyday object and transform it into something a little more three-dimensional with your still life ability. Don't be afraid as well to experiment. You're going to be drawing a whole lot of different objects in your still life, at least 3 of them. So you might have some spherical objects, you might have some cylindrical objects, or you might have some objects that you are just completely lost on. In order to draw these odd objects, please go through and just start thinking about blocking in. Don't forget about it. The legs on this plaster carved stool, the legs are just simply rectangles, as well as the bar between. The top is simply a really flat cylinder, right? Block in with your basic objects, and I promise you they will not fail you.